emancipation for a moment of freedom. Marx, by asserting that the world is going to move in a particular way, Weber by saying the world moves kind of like a railway track. And this, I think, was fueled by the appeal at once scientific and religious, meaning that at the time people believed that to be scientific meant to be able to say something deterministic, something predictable. The world is going this way. And because you're a scientist, you have to be able to assert historical determinism. At the same time, I think it's kind of a legacy of old religious kind of belief in faith. That it has certain appeal. And certainly people have argued about scientific revolution in 17th century Europe that without believing in some way in God's, God-made universe of order and stability, you couldn't have had this breakthrough, intellectual breakthrough. Because if you genuinely believe, as people do today, 21st century chaos and complexity, people would not have tried to make science, like Newtonian science, that's very predictable and deterministic. So what happens then is that there continue to be today people who believe in true science. Political scientists believing in rational choice theory, psychologists believing in evolutionary psychology. They believe that they have their mode of doing science, which is true because it's deductive. But in social science, sociology especially, but in other social science fields, what really is done is empiricism. People simply study their small fields of inquiry, right? And study mainly the facts. I mean, they'll talk about theory, but really it's not really theory in the sense that I talk about in terms of classical social theory. And overall, people begin to believe in the norm, but also the necessity of neutrality, objectivity, and the scientific mindset or the scientific method. So the net effect is essentially that people begin to throw away the legacy of classical social theory. People don't really believe it. But as I keep on saying, it's always a matter of having good theory or bad theory, right? Because people inevitably smuggle in assumptions about the way human beings are, the way social life works, and that you can't live without some theory. And so, in the absence of thinking about them, what people do is essentially to create or reproduce the problems that I mentioned, right? They believe or continue to use the same analysis, the nation state, for example. They're very often ethnocentric, even without meaning to, and they even often smuggle in various value commitments that they don't question. Okay. Go through very quickly, and then we'll take a break. So what does this mean for our knowledge of, or Western knowledge of East Asia? Well, I mean, the West, so to speak, had always had, or had had, long tradition of Orientalism, right? And this is because as long as people could make out, Western intellectuals were vaguely aware that China, for example, was civilized. By civilized, I just mean that they had complex system of writing, complex system of polity, and so on. And it's the case simply that in the 18th century, for example, many of the Enlightenment thinkers, like Leibniz and Voltaire, even became something of a Sinophile. I mean, they began to look at China as a better way to do things than in the West. And basically that was complete misunderstanding, because they seem to really believe that intellectuals rule in China, which, as you know, is not really true. Later on, of course, there are philosophers like Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Asian philosophy. So they've always had some knowledge of Asia. And there are always missionaries and business people who who went to East Asia, learned languages, customs, and so on. But it's only after World War II, as I mentioned in the first lecture, that Western scholars begin to generate systematic understanding of East Asia. And this is made possible, actually, largely by the profound wealth and reach of American and, to a lesser extent, European and Japanese scholars. I mean, this happens, of course, before World War II as well, but they engage in archaeological expeditions. You know, they would go to Kunpa and find all these scrolls and books and take them back to Oxford or Paris or wherever. They begin to essentially create editions. And it's even true for a lot of popular genres, right? It's often Western scholars who begin to recover traditions or traditions of knowledge that were not popular in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and so on. And most importantly, Western libraries and museums become the basic repositories of treasures from East Asia. So many people will be surprised if they go to British Museum, British Library, or libraries of Harvard or Berkeley or wherever, how many books there are. And very often the library has more than even the leading libraries in East Asia. One of the advantages, of course, that Western scholars had is that being non-native, they had an implicit comparative view. Right? And one of the things that I'll talk about more later is that East Asian scholars actually were limited by kind of believing in nationalist mythologies. I'll talk more about this later. But basically, if you're an outsider, if you're a Westerner, you just didn't believe in kind of nationalist ideologies. So they could do a more objective study, if you will. But what did they do, in fact? Well, I want to argue, right, because we don't have much time, but by and large, what people tried to do was try to prove whatever theories that they wanted to prove. The book I mentioned, Bell's Book of Religion, tried to show that Parsons was basically right by following Weber's model. And what's really curious about this book is that it in turn creates a lot of imitators. So people begin to try to look for the parallel or equivalent of Puritan ethic, Protestant ethic in Korea, China, Vietnam, wherever you want to go. The second reason is, of course, that in part because of critique of ethnocentrism, people begin to realize that to create a true science or a universalistic social science, it's actually very important to be able to adduce, meaning to use non-Western cases. Right? So even if you believe in modernization theory, people felt you had to have case studies that prove the theory that you have. And in this instance, was just true for Marxism as well. People begin to study East Asia from Marxist perspective, but they try basically to prove that Marx was right, or Marxism is basically right. The final impulse was that people just wanted to accumulate knowledge. The most famous case is Human Relations Area File, that in order to have a truly universal science, people actually argued that you need to have data and information about every existing culture. So Human Relations Area File tried to send scholars around the world to collect data about every culture that exists. Okay. But the real change happens, again, as I mentioned earlier, in the 60s and 70s. Because these young people, now very old, begin to rebel against their teachers. And this really is the beginning of what we might call critical Asian studies. Right? Because of the war in Vietnam, because some people were attracted by the example of the Chinese Revolution, especially the Cultural Revolution, they begin to really question things like ethnocentrism, things like the assumptions about American exceptionalism. What's wrong with them? Well, I want to say that for much of 20th century, even though they did good work in many ways, their usefulness was limited. Why is that? Well, one reason is the legacy of something like Orientalism. Right? And it converged with the belief in the salience of the nation state as a basic unit of analysis. So everyone began to almost look for essences of cultures. Right? Japan, Korea, China, and Vietnam to some extent. That they could only study these nation states as unified culture. The second problem was that the most explicit theory that these critics have was Marxism. And as I mentioned, it actually was never that useful in making sense of non-Western societies. The third difficulty is slightly different. That there was a whole series of methodological difficulties, of which the two most important were languages. Now, this may, I mean, of course, in one sense, that if you're not a native Chinese educated person, it's hard to read Chinese. Of course, that's true. But that's actually not what I mean. I mean more that they could never go beyond the national language. Right? So if you wanted, for example, to study Taiwan in 1950s and 60s, you probably have to know Taiwanese, or if you're studying Japanese, you needed to know the various Aboriginal languages. But people by and large would only learn Mandarin. Not only because Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang tried to argue that everyone's in Taiwan speaks Mandarin, but also people just didn't have the equipment, knowledge actually, or the ways to study non-Mandarin languages. So they reproduce very stilted perspective on study of places like Taiwan. And second is the point I mentioned earlier as well. Because the repository of data was essentially national data, right? They could never have the resources to collect the kind of data that probably would have been much more useful in eliminating whatever that people were interested in eliminating. There are also other factors I'll go over very quickly. One is the Cold War. It ended more or less 25 years ago. But Cold War had a very, very strange impact on scholarship. One is, of course, that there was a great deal of censorship. It's hard to remember because we're not alive. But you couldn't get a lot of books. So Marx, for example, was illegal in much of East Asia. You couldn't read it. There was a lot of skewed funding and appointment practices, meaning that you could not be to curriculum, right? Because you have to follow the ideological line of South Korean authoritarian government or Kuomintang or whatever. But Cold War went beyond that because Cold War was an era when people actually had very limited access to information and even to places. You couldn't really get into China, mainland China, until late 70s for most people. And even then it was quite limited. You couldn't go into the countryside. And finally, I'm not going to talk about this very much, but Cold War created a particular way of understanding the world, which turned out to be very deeply problematic. I won't go into it, but suffice it for me to say that, for example, Korea, as you know, is divided into two countries, North and South Korea. And in fact, they become very different countries, obviously. I mean, we all know this. But there's a very curious collision whereby people still pretend that Korea is one. So even though all the explanation people might have for South Korea, if you look at North Korea, possibly couldn't work. So for example, some people wanted to argue that the reason South Korea became capitalist was because of Confucian ethic, Confucian work ethic. It's like a Protestant work ethic, right? That's the argument. But if you look at North Korea, I mean, it's the same culture, roughly, but it's kind of hard to see the same thing going on. Anyway, that's a very small example. But the Cold War way of looking at things just kind of erased a lot of things. The other two are, I think in some ways, much more important today. One is what I would just call triumphalism, meaning that people increasingly began to believe that East Asia was successful and therefore different. This first came to fore with Japan. Ezra Bogo, another Harvard professor, wrote a famous book called Japan is Number One, which was published in 1979. And I was alive back then. And what was interesting is that people in Japanese studies began to study Japan as a very, very unique case because Japan was so successful. The rise of China, by which I mean mainland China, also creates a very strange scholarship for people who look for particular and peculiar Chinese characteristics to explain the rise of China. And this has a very distorting effect on scholarship. Japan's no longer number one, so of course no one studies it. But we have this lot of books trying to explain why Japanese auto industry is the best in the world because of X, Y, and Z, and so on. The final limitation is that Asian studies developed as a very a-theoretical and in many ways anti-theoretical discipline. Right? And there are many reasons, but the two most important, I think, are one, that obviously the available theories, Marxism, modernization theory, just didn't seem to work when people began to study, take your favorite East Asian country, Japan, Taiwan, wherever. And area studies, in which most scholars produce scholarship, was in general very antithetical to theory formation. So people wanted essentially kind of a cultural essentials understanding of societies. So what I'll end up with is a very, very curious phenomenon, right? Even though East Asian studies is very large in the US, and in fact in Europe as well as East Asia, as far as I know, there's actually not a single book that's had a theoretical impact outside of East Asian studies. Right? That is to say, of all the many books written about East Asia, not one is considered to be a major contribution to theory. Right? That is to say, it's a book read outside of East Asian studies. In contrast, Southeast Asian studies, which is actually a much, much smaller field, very few people study Southeast Asia. There are at least 3 books which are not just classics, but considered to be major theoretical contributions. put Virtue's book on fictional cultures. Virtue was an anthropologist who began to study Java, Indonesia. Ben Anderson, another Indonesian scholar of Indonesia, wrote Imagined Communities, which is widely read. It's a critique of course, nationalist ideology. James Scott wrote a book called Weapons of the Weak, which is Gramscian in inspiration, and kind of trying to make sense of counter-hegemonic social movements. And again, a Southeast Asianist, talking about the Philippines, to some extent, Vietnam, Thailand. And it's very, very interesting. And I can speculate on the reasons why. Maybe it's the philological kind of emphasis on text that's true in East Asian studies. There's something that I call the curse of area studies, which is a simple point that people began to be kind of like the people they study, the place they study. So if you study Japan, you become kind of like Japanese. It's actually really true. Right? You study Russia, everyone starts drinking vodka. But I don't know, I don't know the reason actually, for sure. But the fact remains that even though East Asian studies is a huge field, many people study it, it simply has not had a major theoretical contribution coming from East Asia. Okay, why don't we take a 7-minute break so that you can think about questions.